This week, we are starting with our unit on personal identity, which will be this week and next week. And so the inspiration for these questions is, what's the question this week is, what am I? And then next week is, who am I? Kind of the same question, really. But the idea is that this week, what we'll talk about are concepts of identity to do with what makes that I, that thing that I refer to myself as when I say I'm hungry or hi, I'm Spencer, right? Like the subject of our lives. What is that thing? Who is that person? And how are we committed to that person? And not in, strictly speaking, like an ethical sort of commitment, like what are my dues for myself kind of way, but rather like what in the same sort of way that like water is H2O, right? We're going to be interested in identity and its components. What allows the I that we refer to persist over time. So at any individual moment, at a time slice, you might say, I am this, but what makes me one time slice later, one time slice earlier, the same thing that, I was through that period of time? Am I always changing? Is there anything constant that persists? Is there truly a self at all? And this week, our introduction to this is John Locke, who basically invents the philosophy of personal identity. Now, I'm sure that people were worried about personal identity well before John Locke came around, but he's really the first one in again, our Western tradition to introduce these ideas as interesting problems to be thought about and resolved. Now, Locke's answers are themselves interesting, though almost certainly incomplete, but you can't blame a guy for being incomplete in inventing an issue. Of course, it's going to happen. You got to start somewhere, right? So we'll talk about Locke's psychological continuity criterion. I'll contrast it with a bodily criterion and some ideas to do with attachment to body. We'll go through some thought experiments. And then next week, we will take sort of an opposite tack towards the same goal, in which we will examine whether or not there is a self at all. So for that, we're reading Hume, and I think I have you also watching a video from Parfit, who wrote this awesome book, Reasons and Persons. And both Hume and Parfit give excellent reasons to support the idea that there is no self, or rather the self that we are concerned with, the I that I refer to just then and when I speak about myself, and that sort of sense that I have of there being a me, of a Spencer, and of you, whoever you are, as being the subject of your life, is not the kind of thing that the self is not a kind of thing that we might intuitively think of ourselves as. This is Parfit, and I know that's like cryptic, right? I didn't really say much of anything there, except that Parfit's idea of self is just atypical and interesting in that. And so next week will be quite a lot of thought experiments too. It's kind of a fun lecture. I really enjoy giving that one. Okay, so before jumping off into the deep end with this stuff, I wanted to chat a little bit about administration. I did all the grades for the discussion boards, so those are all up to date, like up to the point of the start of class, or at least like 30 minutes ago. I haven't looked in the last 30 minutes. All assignments are graded. So if you have questions about grades or anything really, reach out or ask now. No need to forever hold your peace. Also keep in mind that as the midterm is coming up in, I think, 2 weeks, I think it's like February 14th is when it opens. I'm not sure, check the syllabus, that you may not earn more than 50 points before the midterm. So if you've earned 50 points, or if you've earned like, 45 points. There's probably not any good reason to take the midterm unless you're very excited to write about these ideas, because you'll only earn, like up to 50. And again, the purpose of this policy is to make it more likely that you stay with the work regularly throughout the semester, rather than just doing everything early on and disappearing. I want you to stick with the course program. So keep that in mind and ask me questions if you have questions about grades or assignments or any of that. And then the other fun thing. So I did it last semester. I'm going to do it this semester too. Kind of a fun promise keeping experiment. So if you write me an email that says something to the effect of, it doesn't need to be exactly, but something to the effect of, "Dear Spencer, I promise, my name, promise to fill out my course evals at the end of the semester." I just do. So promise me, right? Say I, Billy Bob, promise to fill out my course evals at the end of the semester. And you don't actually have to do it. You just have to make the promise, and I will give you 1% of your grade. That's the difference between 89 and a 90, 79 and 80, 73 and a 74. You know how to do addition, hopefully with one. Send me the promise, and then you get the point. You don't need to follow through with the promise, but we'll see. So last semester, just like interesting, fun promise keeping experiment facts. I want to say I got like 44 promises of 75 students, and every one of them filled out their evals. Amazing, right? Kind of cool. I did not expect that. Typically for online classes like this one, you get something like if you're lucky, like 15 to 20% response rate. That was like more than 50%, which was excellent. Evals are really important. They're sort of, for me, the currency going onto the job market. I'm going on next fall to get like a real big boy professor job, right? To like sit and in front of classrooms like this sort of in perpetuity. And you guys in writing your evals have this really important role in enabling me to continue doing that, making the dream a reality. So fun promise keeping experiment, also, just like an important back and forth. So send me those emails. I will give you the extra credit point. Also send an email about this so that everybody on YouTube and who hasn't had a chance to catch up with the lectures yet will know about this as well. So there will be a reminder coming around soon. Any questions administratively, grades, how to keep promises, discussion boards? No? Doing good? Or just fine? Okay, excellent. So let's talk about Locke. So the lecture is structured in the following way. We have a bit of background. We'll talk about the ideas that Locke rejects as viable candidates for a criteria of personal identity through time. We'll talk about Locke's own accepted view, the psychological continuity criterion, and then we'll, at the end, talk about some objections and problems. There's some real worries that even Locke contends with, which it's interesting to see that he was even satisfied with his own definition, given like the gaping holes in his arguments. But he bit the bullet, so to speak. So here's John Locke, looking very dapper. John Locke was a British empiricist. So he's from England. He is sort of a hallmark of British empiricism, which is the follow-up sort of movement to what Descartes and Galileo and the other like mechanical scientists begin, where John Locke is and his British empiricist friends are very much interested in hard data from the actual world. So you might hear I don't know if this is a thing that like comes up much, but it does in philosophy, the debate between empiricism and rationalism, where the empiricists think that all knowledge is a derivative of experience in the world, and the rationalists think rather that there is knowledge that we can have that is a priori or only from the mind, that one need not experience the world at all in order to know things about it. So examples of what might be for the rationalists kind of a priori, non-empirical sort of knowledge is that the internal angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees, or I exist, Descartes, right? Or God exists is often one that the rationalist will give. As opposed to the empiricists who say, no, all of this is derived through experience, that you can't know what a triangle is without having seen and touched and interacted with triangles. That famously, I think this is Locke too, that we're all blank slates, right? That we all start carte blanche from nothing, and it's through experience that knowledge is writ upon our slates, and we grow to be the intelligent creatures that we are through that experience. Now, empiricism and rationalism aren't just about knowledge and knowledge acquisition. There's also a whole interesting quality of like how to acquire that knowledge, which is shared by both, by and large. So the rationalist, Descartes is famously a rationalist, is interested in doing empirical science just as well as the empiricist. It's just they're starting sort of with different intuitions about what should count as knowledge. So the empiricists are also very much scientists and interested in collecting data so that they can derive the sort of knowledge that they're really excited about. Locke's big essay, the big work that explodes and begins so many different fields of philosophy, and that we read today and is still referenced today all over the place, is the essay concerning human understanding. So in this essay, John Locke deals with everything, with ethics and politics and identity, with substance and science and metaphysics and everything, right? It's an essay concerning human understanding, which concerns everything. And so Locke, being of this generation of thinkers in Europe who were experts across the board, is likewise bringing to bear his expertise across all fields of both natural but mostly moral philosophy. He also writes 2 treatises of government, which is his also famous work. I think that's where you get the life, liberty, pursuit of property bit, and like judge, jury, executioner stuff that we see in the American Constitution was a huge inspiration to Jefferson and other founding fathers. So, Locke's ideas are writ into the very fabric of our American ethos, philosophically speaking, that the ideas of the framers were very much inspired by the ideas of John Locke. So we're not going to do the political side of John Locke or really any of this judge, jury, executioner stuff, state of nature arguments, which you might talk about in some intro classes. In fact, we might have talked about it had it not been for the Mengzi Shunzi lecture coming up, where we discuss human nature. In a typical philosophy class, you would look at human nature and the state of nature stuff through John Locke's eyes, and usually like Hobbes and Rousseau too. These names you might be familiar with from like a social studies class in high school. Sometimes comes up there as well, but we're going to be taking an Eastern perspective on those issues. So we will be talking today about Locke on identity. Okay. So what John Locke does for personal identity, as I said, is he sort of like invents the problem of personal identity. What is this I that I refer to that hadn't really been a question that had been dealt with in any great detail before John Locke? And the problem is to do with the numeric identity of persons across time. So it's not just a question like, who am I? What am I, right? It's more specific than that. What makes John Locke's treatment of the issue interesting and important and remembered to this day, and why we're talking about it tonight, is that what Locke is doing is asking, what is numeric identity? So I think, do I define? Okay, so there is a distinction to be made between numeric identity and qualitative identity. Okay, so qualitatively identical would be like identical twins, right? That you don't know very well. You look at them and you think, wow, these two people look just the same. There's a qualitative, that the quality, the features that they share are just the same. If I were to, I won't do it because I don't have a marker in front of me, but if I were to take a black marker and I were to draw a circle here and a circle here, right? Two black marker circles, they would be qualitatively identical. For all intents and purposes, they look like the same thing, but they are not numerically identical. So numeric identity is a one-to-one relation with itself. It like X equals X in algebraic language, right? So what we're interested in numeric identity is something is itself if and only if it shares all of the same properties with itself, which is just like a really wordy way of saying X equals X. The formulation of this in logic is called Leibniz's law, which I think is for all X, if there exists some X that has Y properties, then if there also exists a Y for whom all of Y's properties are X's properties, then X equals Y. That's like numeric identity. And it's just to say that there is only one instance of an object. So the two black circles on the board that you're imagining I drew here are not numerically identical, even though they look just the same. They're qualitatively identical because they have different properties. One is on the left and one's on the right. Maybe I draw a circle and then I erase it. I draw another circle in the same exact spot in the same exact way. I'm really good at drawing circles, for instance. These would be, again, qualitatively identical, but they would have a difference temporally, that one existed at time one and the other existed at time two, and they didn't exist at the same time. This is what we want for numeric identity. So what kind of numeric identity can we get with personal identity? Where do we get something more than just qualitatively identical features in the self? Which is to say, what makes the self truly persist through time and not just sort of resemble itself through time? What makes the I live on? And what this emphasis on numeric identity does is it moves the emphasis on substance or body and life and soul to an emphasis on mind. And this is, we'll see this as we get into the psychological continuity criterion for personal identity, which is Locke's ultimate answer to this question of numeric identity of persons. But the way that the self had been treated beforehand was either like I'm my body, or according to the church, like I'm my soul, right? Locke gives objections to these views, these classically held views, the intuitive view of I'm just like whatever this thing is, right? Or I'm whatever soul, God gave me upon being born, conceived, whatever. And like Locke is not an atheist by any stretch. And he still gives really good reasons for thinking why the soul should not be that criterion upon which we establish the numeric identity of persons. And this is kind of like an interesting shift, right? So think empiricists living in 1700s when everybody in Europe is Christian. And Locke is giving really non-Christian answers to these problems, answers that depend upon what we can examine through our experience, which ends up being to do with consciousness, memory, and psychology. Most contemporary theories of personal identity do trace to Locke. They're variants of his psychological continuity criterion, or are otherwise explicit opponents. So Locke is a figurehead in this personal identity literature. If you are reading or writing researching whatever personal identity, Locke will come up everywhere. And you either say, look, my view is Lockean. It's not Locke's, but it's Lockean in that I agree with him. And here's how I refine and edit the account. Or alternatively, it's like a non-Lockean, anti-Lockean view, where you say Locke was totally wrong because identity is actually this, right? And his name is huge pretty much everywhere in the personal identity literature. Okay, so we'll talk about the substance criterion. So what's going to happen next is I'll go through sort of Locke's discourse on identity and his different options, his different choices for what might count as a good definition of, or criterion, as I've been saying, for what helps identity persist through time. So Locke's first target is this substance criterion. Is identity to do with substance, meaning like physical matter, right? So the question is, can whatever physically exists be the proper account or criterion of what makes who we are what we are? So what is substance? Well, we think of substance in terms of atoms. A single simple atom is a continued body under one immutable superficie existing in a determined time and place. It is evident that considered in any instance of its existence, it is in that instance the same with itself, right? X equals X, this thing. For being at that instant what it is and nothing else, it is the same and so must continue as long as its existence is continued. So what's Locke saying here? Saying imagine a single atom in a single time slice, one snapshot of time. That atom is identical with itself because nothing changes. Right? It is always and only itself. It has no shifting properties. The simple unity, the oneness of it is unchanged, and so it has its own identity. Now, there's also a way of understanding identity in terms of complex bodies. So not as a single individual unit, but rather several units put together. So if two or more atoms are joined together, simple bodies become complex bodies. The mass consisting of the same atoms must be the same mass. Every one of those atoms will be the same by the foregoing rule. And whilst they exist united together, the mass consisting of the same atoms must be the same mass. Let the part be ever so differently jumbled. But if one of these atoms should be taken away or one new one added, it is no longer the same mass as the body, right? And this makes sense. If I have, like atom 1, atom 2, atom 3, atom 4, atom 5, clumped together, and I remove atom 5, whatever is left over is not what it used to be. If I add atom 6, it's no longer what it used to be. It's only this thing when it has all and only the same properties. So same idea with the simple body, except we've added complexity to it. We've added more simple bodies together, and you get like a larger, more holistic unity, which would be the identity of the complex body. So you can think like atom and molecule or something to that effect. Non-living artifacts can also have an identity. So if we, and an artifact here is like a human creation, like a chair or a pen or whatever. So if we would suppose this machine, one continued body, all whose organized parts were repaired, increased, or diminished by a constant addition or separation of insensible parts, with one common life, we should have something very much like the body of an animal, with this difference, that in an animal, the fitness of the organization and the motion wherein life consists coming from within, but in machines, the force coming sensibly from without. Okay, so what's Locke saying here? What is the difference between a teddy bear and an actual bear? Assuming that the teddy bear looks just like a real bear. Well, it's that the bear has an internal ability to move itself. It's self-motile. But each have a certain constituent set of parts. They each have paws. They each have a snout and eyes. And that if you removed any of these parts or shifted them around so that they were, like Mr. Potato Head, like you put the arm out the eye hole, it no longer resembles the Mr. Potato Head we know from the Toy Story movies, that this would shift its identity, that there's a certain organization to the artifact, the teddy bear, that if that organization changes, then so does the identity of the thing. And the same should be true for the living artifact, the actual bear, that if you were to, like put its paw on its head, then it wouldn't be the same kind of thing. We wouldn't call it bear, we'd call it a literal freak of nature. And so for a chair to remain a chair, it should have a function. It should be shaped just as it's shaped for sitting and resting your arms, for holding your back up, etc. And its purpose fulfills that function because it's organized as such. But a living organism, say like a plant, is something different from an artifact. So imagine the oak tree, right? The oak tree starts as an acorn and it grows into a sapling, which then becomes the full oak tree. And we consider this a single entity, an object. It has some kind of identity that the sapling, or say like the acorn that we plant, we say, hey, that sapling right there is the acorn that I planted. And then 10 more years go by and you say, hey, that oak tree that's now producing its own acorns, I planted that there as a little acorn. And so this kind of living organism itself has a different sense of identity than the simple body and the complex body and the artifact, right? It has what we might call, instead of a substance criterion, right, which has to do with the organization of the substance and whether or not we're like adding, removing, or shifting around parts, so it's differently organized, the substance that is. Now we're talking about something to do with continuity. So it's not just about the matter, because the matter of the tree changes through time, right? Now, when we refer to the identity of the acorn, the sapling, and the tree, we're referring not to its matter, but rather to what continues through all of the changes in matter. So says Locke, if we would suppose this machine one continued body, all whose organized parts were repaired, increased, or diminished by a constant, I read that one, sorry. We must therefore consider wherein an oak differs from a mass of matter. The one is only a cohesion of particles of matter, anyhow united, the other such a disposition of them as constitutes the part of the oak. That being then one plant which has such an organization of parts in one coherent body, partaking of one common life, it continues to be the same plant as long as it partakes of the same life, though that life be communicated to new particles of matter, vitally united to the living plant, in a like continued organization, conformable to those sorts of plants. So, I mean, Locke is just saying in way more complicated Old Englishy sort of way, what I've just said, that as the xylem and the phloem move nutrients up and down the tree, it collects nutrients from its roots in the soil and then sheds them in the fall as it loses all of its leaves, and regrows them as it reabsorbs nutrients from photosynthesis and uptake of minerals to the soil. It's adding and subtracting all sorts of matter. So its substance is always in flux, it's always changing. And what really matters when we say that's the same tree as it was when it was an acorn is that it shares the same form of life, that whatever was that continuous, persisting sense of life, which we don't dig any deeper into here, at least with Locke. It is a really interesting question, like what might count as life for a single species or organism. That's what we mean when we talk about like the identity of a plant. If you're interested in this particular example, our department does a lot of philosophy of biology, and you get a lot of like individuation problems in biology. And specifically botany. I studied botany in college. I love plants. The Bristlecone Pine is I think the oldest living organism is a Bristlecone Pine somewhere around Zion, in that area. That's like where they naturally grow. And I think it's called Methuselah. It must be something like 6,500 years old. It's a really old tree. And they don't tell you the location of it because they don't want anybody to kill it. There was an older one that a graduate student I think he was a graduate student, did a core sample. So you like take a little rod basically that's hollow and you drill it into the tree and then you pull it out, and it lets you count the rings, which tells you how old it was. He couldn't get his core out of the tree, so he just chopped it down and ended up being the oldest living organism that anybody had ever measured, and he got like tons of hate mail. Anyways, interesting feature about bristlecone pines to do with this example in this issue is that because they're so old, in a single branch, it can grow for like 2,000 years. The DNA, the genetic composition of the branch close to the trunk will be different than it is out where the new growth is farther along the branch. So even within the same organism, you have a different genetic structure in the same branch, right? So if you want to say, well, it's the same life form and life is just DNA, baby, then you would be wrong with respect to Methuselah and the bristlecone pine. Also interesting stuff to do with fungus and mycelia and all that as well. But those are issues for another philosophy class. For Locke, the form of life is enough to consider the continuity of a plant, a single identity. But again, an animal is different from a plant. What do we mean when we say an animal has a continuous form of life? Well, the case is not so much different in brutes, meaning animals. In an animal, the fitness of the organization and the motion wherein life consists begin together, the motion coming from within. So the form of life of a plant is different from the form of life of an animal, say like our bear, in that it has its own, like, agency is the wrong word, but at least like its own capacity to move itself, and always has. That even the butterfly that escapes the chrysalis formed by the caterpillar is the same being despite having no qualitative resemblance, caterpillar to butterfly, can still have a numeric continuity, right? Insofar as its principle of motion, what it lives to do of its own being, and whatever that's supposed to mean, is the same. The life cycle, so to speak, right? The life cycle of the caterpillar through chrysalis to butterfly is just the same. Humans are different from animals, so says Locke at least. This also shows wherein the identity of the same man consists vis-a-vis in nothing but a participation of the same continued life by constantly fleeting particles of matter in succession vitally united to the same organized body. So a human is the same thing as itself as long as it has the same principle of motion, same organization. That I'm different from you because I'm in this body and I have this cycle of life and you have your cycle of life as well. But this is going to turn out to be insufficient when we're talking about personal identity. Maybe like the human body, right? So if there's two vegetative in coma humans, they would share an equivalent form of life. They would be different people because the life cycle is different in each, but they would share an equivalent form of life. But as soon as you say like there's like a living, breathing, thinking human as opposed to your comatose vegetative state one, then we start wanting to say, well, what makes them is different in each case. That you might get the vegetative thing in the comatose person, but you have something a little bit extra, which would be something to do, according to Locke, with mind. Okay, so let's summarize. The substance criteria works only for the identity of the simplest of objects, atoms and simple masses, molecules, or whatever. But for the identity of most of our natural and artifactual kinds, Locke proposes a continuity criteria, right? That it's not in the matter, but in what persists that we care about when we talk about identity. But none of these criteria are adequate for the identity of persons over time, like maybe the human form, like the human as an animal, but the human as a person isn't satisfied by life cycle, right? We all are born and live and then die, but that's not what individuates us. What individuates us is something special, something different from the fact of our being in a life cycle. So Locke's aim for his account of personal identity, what's Locke going after? Well, what he wants to do is give an account of what we describe as numeric identity, right? For persons, which is to be distinguished from human body, human animal, that A is consistent with the possibility of an afterlife. Remember, Locke is a Christian, okay? So Locke wants his, whatever he comes up with, to be consistent with his faith and his religious convictions, but isn't going to be determined by his faith and his religious convictions. He's a good empiricist. He's a scientist, and he wants to, like come up with a satisfying answer. And that doesn't mean that religion cannot give him a satisfying answer. It just means that he'll investigate his faith and religious beliefs like he would any other natural belief or scientific answer. But it is important that whatever he has faith in be consistent with the answer that he gives, and not just because that's important to him as a Christian, but sort of in general, if you are a inflammatory atheist, or really at all atheist or anti-Christian back then, you were in big trouble. Not good for you as a social move. So A, consistent with the possibility of afterlife. B, that the account of numeric identity of persons across time should provide some explanation of the fact that personal identity matters to each of us, right? It's not just this esoteric, zoomed out, who knows what the heck we're talking about when we say, what am I? No, it's like we matter to ourselves, and what we are like socially matters too. So knowing what it is that makes a person might be the sort of thing upon which we ground the concept of something like dignity, right? That all humans are due their just dues, like there's human rights, and internet and food and shelter should be human rights. Oh no, like I just said something that is controversial. They should be. And the reason that they're human rights typically is because we say that humans have dignity, or there's something special about us, that we should take care of each other, or whatever. And maybe when we talk about what we are, that's part of what we mean. It's not this solipsistic, esoteric, what am I? But really, it's a question that matters. And so the explanation of personal identity should also explain that sort of normative component, like the component of like, I care about this, right? It's not, if I came up with an answer of what personal identity was that satisfied all of my philosophical intuitions, my metaphysical ramblings and goings on, my, like mystical, esoteric experience, but it didn't actually explain why I care about having a self, and why having a concept of identity matters for how we relate to each other, then it's an empty definition. And so Locke is interested in giving us a definition that matters for how we interact with ourselves and with each other. But as it's going to turn out, A and B are in tension with one another, since the standard candidate for A is a soul. But Locke doesn't think that a soul is consistent with B. This is, in fact, going to be his argument against the soul criterion of personal identity through time, is that the soul doesn't give us that sort of existential grip. It doesn't give us the content that we need to explain why we care about this problem, why we care about this question. And I think these arguments are compelling, and it's interesting that it comes from someone who believes in a soul anyways, and the importance of a soul. But the relationship between soul and identity for Locke will come apart. Okay, so what are some of the rejected views? Right? What does Locke say is no good? Well, he rejects the body criterion, right, which is just the like, I am this body. He rejects the human life animal criterion, because we're all human animals, but we're not the same in spite of it. So that doesn't seem to individuate us. And he denies the soul criterion. The body criterion is a substance criterion, like has to do with what we're made of. And these two are going to be continuity criterion, just to bring back our concepts. So substance criterion, how does Locke reject the body criterion? So Locke says persons are bodies, of course, we all have bodies. A person, P2, that'll be their name, at T2, meaning time 2. So person 2 at some future time, P2 at T2, is the same person as P1, the first person, at T1 at a first time, if and only if. So that, just step aside from the argument for just a second. When you read if and only if, what you're reading is a logical equivalency. You're reading the biconditional arrow, the arrow that goes in both directions, meaning that one side of the equation is the same as the other side of the equation. Given one set of conditions, you have necessarily another set of conditions. So when you read if and only if, you should be reading equals. Okay, so person 2 at time 2 is the same person as person 1 at time 1, if and only if. So how do we get person 2 at time 2 the same as person 1 at time 1? Well, we get that only when person 2 at time 2 has the same physical body as person 1 at time 1. This would be the body continuity criterion of identity. But as Locke objects, the limbs of his body are to every one a part of himself. He sympathizes and is concerned for them. Cut off a hand and thereby separated from that consciousness he had of its heat, cold, and other affectations. And then it is no longer a part of that which is himself any more than the remotest part of matter. So I'm not going to open the YouTube video, but the idea is like, look, if the bodily continuity criterion of personal identity says that you are the same person you were 10 minutes ago, right? So 10 minutes ago, you're person 1 at time 1, and right now you're person 2 at time 2. You're the same person as long as you have the same body. But say you had your hand chopped off. Are you going to say you're a different person than you were before you had your hand chopped off? Well, I mean, you have a different body, so you must be a different person. But that's not really the case, right? That's not what we would say. I wouldn't say that like, I am a fundamentally brand new person. I was born the day that my hand was chopped off, right? That's kind of absurd. This is how we get the objection from Locke to the bodily continuity criterion. The video is, have you guys seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail? Are you familiar with this? The Black Knight scene? Where he's fighting the Black Knight and he chops off limb by limb and the guy keeps trying to fight him and says, "'Tis but a scratch." So it's the same Black Knight even though he's lost all his limbs. So the body can't be the criterion of personal identity. Let's pause here. Do we agree with this? Do we agree that the body is an unsatisfactory criteria for identity through time? Should we disagree with Locke's objection here and say, in fact, yeah, I do think that the body is what makes us what we are? You agree more with Locke? Okay. The body's no good. Why do you agree with Locke?
I'm curious what it'll go on to say about the mind, but I feel like a person is more defined by what's going on in their brain rather than the state of their body.
Good. So a person is more defined by their brain than the state of their body, because the state of your body can be in any strange condition. But if your mind substantially changes, so like I can lose a hand and be the same person, but if my mind substantially changes, say like, I don't know, I have amnesia and I wake up, then I might consider myself to be someone entirely different, right? Even in like bipolar disorder, where you have like resemblance qualitatively, say, between different states of mind, you might represent and present identity completely differently in a like manic or depressed state or something. Good. Anybody else online? I think I heard somebody taking their mic off. What do we think? Does anybody feel like the body is what matters for identity?
Yeah, I was going to say as well, it's mainly the mind for me. That is the real substantial, like, anchored to the body, I believe, would be maybe the right term.
Okay. All right, you brain people. The mind is located in the brain. What if we goof around with the brain? Isn't that goofing around with the body? Yes,
So I
we'll
think
talk about that.
I think the mind would be considered the actual person. However, the body can affect the mind.
Right. Yeah. Most of your serotonin's in your gut. When you get stressed, you get gut issues. When you have gut issues, that affects your mind. So we are a very delicate and balanced ecosystem of physical components from which the mind springs, right? It's called Epi Phenomenalism in metaphysics, where you get like mind is supposed to be epiphenomenal on body, where they're not the same thing, but you can't have the one without the other. Wherever the one moves, the other tracks. It's a fun concept. Yeah.
Maybe just a kind of an interesting idea, like let's say that this person one and person two is a professional tennis player, and then between time one and time two lose their hand, they're sure to be a different person because now they can no longer be a professional tennis player.
Good.
So losing that hand did fundamentally change who they are. And that can go for anybody. You can't open the door with your left hand anymore. You can't make yourself a bowl of cereal. You can't knit anymore.
Yeah.
So even though you are losing a part of your body and you're still fundamentally the same person, there is a change in there somewhere, right? There has to be.
Excellent. Yeah. So this is to emphasize the importance of body, right, in personal identity. That the example is a tennis player. So say like Roger Federer got in some terrible accident and lost the use of his racket swinging hand. Roger Federer's entire identity is as like one of the best tennis players of all time. And to lose that would be to lose oneself, right? That that this physical part of me is what I am. And for that to be broken would be to lose something that is substantial and significant for myself. And so whatever self ends up on the other end should be something different. Good. So the body is important. How about this one? So should we do this now or should we wait for the, how about this? We'll wait for my thought experiment. I'll do it in a moment. Does anybody at this point, now we've like had a few ideas of identity, want to say what the I is that you talk about when you say I am this or whatever? Anybody have any thoughts? Who are you? What are you? What do you refer to when you say I am this?
I'll go. Kind of building off your Roger Federer example. I'm a soccer player. I play soccer for the team here at the U, and I think a lot of my self-identity is revolved around that. Growing up with sports, growing up with soccer, and I mean, I can't imagine what it would be like, or what I would be like if I didn't have like that part of me.
Good. Good. So the activity of playing soccer is not the same as Devin, right? But there is an inextricable link between what's shared by you and that activity. But is that link somewhere in you, even though the activity is out there?
I would consider it part of me, that link, because yeah, it's like an external thing playing soccer, but a lot of my personality, a lot of my work ethic, things that motivate me or that have made me me have came through that link. And so yeah, I think it started as something external, but as time went on, it becomes more internal as my life more revolves around it.
Good. Yeah. And so you might extend the analogy. I was thinking of like a bodybuilder. Say they existentially, that just like what they are is a bodybuilder, right? And I think you're right to say, like, look, there's all sorts of personality affects that come from the sort of rigor that comes with athletic training. Like maybe in addition to being a bodybuilder and having like, determinate self-motivation, maybe you also have the inability to scratch your back, and this could be like a family joke, and that relationship between your activity and the family joke is incidental, but is an important reflection of like your other important relationships with your loved ones. So the effect of experience in the world can not only shift our physical forms, but our mental forms and how we interact with others as well. Good. So what we should be seeing in these answers is that identity is complicated, and the very first shots at definition that Locke has given us are kind of simple, right? X equals X, a simple body, complex body, same form of life. His ultimate answer is going to be a little simple as well, which is what makes it fun to deal with. But what I mean to impress here is that identity seems to have a lot to do with quite a lot of features of us, both physical, mental, and relational, meaning like how we experience the world, and the world is shifted through our experience of it. Good. Okay, so we'll do thought experiments in a moment, but there's the body criterion. Locke also rejects the human life, human animal criterion. So this again would just be person two at time two, right? Like the future person is the same as the past person, if and only if they share, or if they're the same human animal. But, says Locke, whoever should see a creature of his own shape or make, though it had no more reason all its life than a cat or a parrot, would still call him a man. So he's saying like, look, if someone is born and grows up a human and, barks like a dog and meows like a cat and never says anything about never acquires language, we'd still call that person a human. But we would also call the person who reasons and uses language and communicates in the world a human as well. And there's a very big difference between those two things. Okay, so Locke is denying the sufficiency of being human for being a person. I think I've talked about this maybe once before in our class, but other just fun logic language that you should have, necessity and sufficiency. So let's say we have if P then Q, where P is it's raining and Q is the ground is wet. Okay, so if P then Q is our equation, and we fill in these sentences with it's raining and the ground is wet, our sentence then becomes if it's raining, then the ground is wet. Okay, the sufficient condition is it's raining, and the necessary condition is the ground is wet. And these hold different kinds of logical relationships to one another. So it's raining is sufficient for the ground being wet, meaning that as long as you have rain, then the ground must be wet, given our logical construction, that there's no possible world in which the ground is not wet when it's raining, given if P then Q. If P then Q is true, then anytime it rains, the ground must be wet. And this is a sufficient condition. Another sufficient condition would be what's an easy one? A sufficient condition for an object to operate as a chair is that I can sit in it. If I can't sit in it, then it's not a chair. The necessary condition in the if it's raining, then the ground is wet, is the ground is wet. So say if P then Q is true, but I said it's not raining, or if I said the ground isn't wet, this would be to break a necessary condition of it's raining, right? So it's raining is sufficient for the ground being wet, in addition to a bunch of other things like there being water in the air and there being a chance of precipitation, 100% in this case. There's all sorts of necessary conditions that together make it, that explain what it is for it to be raining at all. So if one of those necessary conditions is missing, then the statement it's raining couldn't occur, right? So Q is necessary to P and P is sufficient for Q. And this is like the logical relationship. So when Locke is denying the sufficiency of being a human for being a person, he's saying, look, being a human is not like if it's raining, then the ground is wet. if you are the same human animal, then you have the same like humanity, the same personal identity. No, that's not true, because we can individuate each other on more than just the human animal condition. That's not sufficient to account for what we mean when I say I am this, right? There's something more. There's other necessary conditions that aren't met by the human animal. There's reason, right? There's stuff to do with the mind. So the human animal condition is insufficient for a numeric kind of personal identity through time. Does that make sense? Is that good? Okay, cool. Or whoever should hear a cat or a parrot discourse, reason, and philosophize would call it nothing but a cat or a parrot and say, the one was a dull, irrational man and the other a very intelligent, rational parrot. Again, so now what Locke has done is he's denied the necessity of the human animal condition for being a person through time. Because you don't have to be a human animal. If we heard like Iago from Aladdin, like in real life, we'd say, wow, there's a person in that bird, or that bird is a very intelligent person, even though they have no human form. Kind of sci-fi fantasy, but same idea, right? That what matters for personal identity is not the fact of being human. That's unnecessary to what we mean by identity. Nor is it sufficient. It's not enough to say, look, it's the same human animal, therefore it's the same person. So a condition or criterion that is neither necessary nor sufficient is no criterion at all, right? It is maybe a correlative piece of evidence, but no good for a definition. Does not satisfy the strength of the equality of if and only if. So again, the human animal criterion fails insofar as being the same human animal is neither necessary nor sufficient for personhood. Okay, so what about the soul criterion? I've talked about this a little bit. Persons or souls. Person P2 at T2 is the same as P1 at P1 if and only if P2 at T2 has the same soul as P1 at T1. So if 10 minutes ago I had the same soul as I have now, then I'm the same person. Here's Locke's objection to this idea of soul being the proper criteria for personal identity through time. Let anyone reflect upon himself and conclude that he has in himself an immaterial spirit. Let him also suppose it to be the same soul that was in Nestor or Thersites at the siege of Troy. For souls being, as far as we know anything about them, in their nature indifferent to any parcel of matter, the supposition has no apparent absurdity in it. So what he's saying here is we have no conception of souls as being restricted to any form of like one kind of matter or another. Like a soul could be in me or in you or in a chair or with, like, we don't know what souls are. We don't know how they exist. So there's no contradiction, logically speaking, at least as far as we know, of a soul that, like was in Nestor's body. Nestor is a general of the Greek army at Troy, who told really great stories. And there's no, as far as we know, contradiction of the soul that was in Nestor's body while he was sieging Troy also being the soul that inhabits this body right now, which it may have been. My soul, says Locke, may have been Nestor's, for all I know, as well as it is now the soul of any other man. But he, now having no consciousness of any of the actions either of Nestor or Thersites, does or can he conceive himself the same person as either of them? So say, for instance, the soul of Nestor was now residing in me. Do I have any properties of Nestor? Am I anything like him? Can I remember the siege of Troy? Do I have any of the personal affectations of Nestor? Well, probably not. Can I be concerned? Do I care about Nestor in his life? Do I care about the Greek siege of Troy and being away from family for a decade? Do I attribute any of these properties to myself or think them my own more than the actions of any other man that have ever existed? Do I think that I care more about Napoleon or Nestor or myself if maybe I had all of their souls? So the idea here is that for this person, the soul would no more make him the same person as Nestor than if some of the particles of matter that were once a part of Nestor were now a part of this man. So, like dinosaurs had to pee, right? and that water gets recycled into the ocean, which then becomes clouds, and then the clouds rain, and then we drink recycled dinosaur pee, right? Am I full of dinosaur pee? Well, no, right? Same thing with the soul. As far as we know, a soul could pass through us and shift bodies, who knows? Just because I have a recycled soul doesn't mean that I have any of the things that matter to me about the old life that soul inhabited. I don't have any of the memories. I don't have any of the concerns. I wouldn't say that any of the, like, I don't love Nestor's wife or his sons, right? I don't have any of those commitments. They don't come with the soul, even if I had the same one. So in the same way that matter can move in and out of me without changing what I am, there's nothing to say a soul couldn't do the same thing, move in and out of me without changing who I am likewise. And it is what matters is that it's without the same consciousness, no more making the same person by being united to any body than the same particle of matter without consciousness united to any body makes the same person. So what we're interested in is the sameness of consciousness. And if soul doesn't carry with it consciousness, then it's not going to carry what matters to us in this question of personal identity. So here we have sufficiency again. The soul is insufficient for the identity of persons. It might turn out to be necessary, right? It may be, but it is at least not sufficient. We can't say that if you have the same soul, then you're the same person, right? Because if the soul is recycled, or if there's many souls passing through me or whatever, that wouldn't be what made me persist through time, because I don't have what the old person who had that soul had in me, which is a sameness of consciousness. Oh, wow, that's a large growing arrow. There you go. Sameness of consciousness. See how important that is for Locke? You can see it and tell it's important because of the big arrow that's there. Okay, so Locke also argues that the same soul is not necessary for identity of persons, which is to say that distinct souls can occupy the same person. So you could have like 3 or 4 souls in you, but you'd be the same you, right? There's nothing logically or like, you know, theologically that necessitates the fact that you couldn't have several souls in you at once. But this is not what makes you you, right? There's a sameness of consciousness that we're looking for that isn't satisfied by the theological conception of the soul. So Locke has now rejected the body criterion, the human animal criterion, and the soul criterion for personal identity. None of these really do what we want them to do. They're necessary, unnecessary, sufficient, insufficient. None of them are so good. So what Locke does is he gives us the personal identity, or sorry, the psychological continuity criterion. Okay, so throughout Locke's critiques of alternative criteria for identity of persons, he invokes considerations of consciousness. What matters to us is what's going on in the mind. The core intuition is that we continue as persons and are continuous with the past person, P2, T2, P1, T1, by virtue of continued conscious experience. Thus, broadly, psychological continuity, like what our psychology consists in continuing, is going to be the criterion for personal identity. So a person, says Locke, we must consider what person stands for when we use this term, which is a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection and can consider itself as itself, the same thinking thing in different times and places, which it does only by that consciousness, which is inseparable from thinking and essential to it. So persons are conscious, thinking, intelligent things. And what we want is not just a time slice of a person at a time, reasoning and reflecting and having a certain capacity for these abilities, but the person through time doing these, right? And persisting regardless of the shift in temporal space, right? Through time. For since every consciousness always accompanies thinking, and it is that which makes everyone to be what he calls his self, and thereby distinguishes himself from all other thinking things, in this alone consists personal identity. That is the sameness of a rational being, and as far as this consciousness can be extended backwards to any past action or thought, so far reaches the identity of that person. So the way that we distinguish between each other is like, you have different mind than I have, than you have, than we all have. We all think a little different, okay? And this is how I distinguish myself from you guys, is that I'm thinking different from you guys. For being the same consciousness that makes a man to be him, himself to himself, personal identity depends on that only, whether it be annexed solely to one individual substance or can be continued in a succession of several substances. So we have the development of our equation here. Person P2 at T2 is the same person as P1 at T1 if and only if that person at the later time is psychologically continuous with the earlier person at the earlier time. But what is the house? What is the channel through which psychological continuity is explained? Well, it's consciousness, right? That we determine sameness of psychology by sameness of consciousness. That as long as the conscious state persists, then we get a persistence of psychology. So what matters for Locke is a unity of consciousness. But what is it that unites consciousness, right? What is it that allows us to say this conscious state is continuous with this past conscious state, is continuous with this present and future conscious state? Well, it's going to be memory. Okay, so we get a memory criterion of personal identity. That person P2 at T2 is the same as P1 at T1 if and only if P1 and P2 at T1 and T2 share the experiences in memory of each other. Had I the same consciousness that I saw the ark and Noah's flood as that I saw an overflowing of the Thames last winter, or that as I write now, I could no more doubt that I, who write this now, that saw the Thames overflowing last winter and that viewed the flood at the general deluge was the same self, place that self in this, whatever substance you please, that I was yesterday. So I could have been Noah, a millennia ago, and then teleported into this body that, into a, say like a bridge, that then remembers seeing the overflow of this river. And now I've like apparated again into this philosopher that's writing. And, however I transfer consciousness, there's a continuity of consciousness through memory that I feel, not just that I remember, because we can create false memories all we like, but that I feel like these memories were mine, right? It's not just like I'm watching television, right? And I see the main character on the TV show have a flashback in first person. That's a memory that I'm seeing, but it's not mine. I don't feel like I'm there, right? I have to have the memory and the, what you might call like assertoric force, the force of it being real to us, so that the memory is important and that the memory be ours. And as long as that's there, that's what's going to be sufficient for personal identity persisting through time. It's experiential memory that does the work. For as far as any intelligent being can repeat the idea of any past action with the same consciousness it had of it at first, and with the same consciousness it has of any present action, so far as the same personal self. For it is by consciousness it has of its present thoughts and actions that it is self to itself now, and so will be the same self as far as the same consciousness can extend to actions past or to come. So when I feel that whatever it is that allows me to like encode in working in long-term memory some experience, that same property encoding and setting working in long-term memory to task and experience in the future or was in the past, whenever there's that same kind of encoding going on by consciousness, then there I am, and there I have been, and there I will be. Okay, so some advantages of the memory criterion of personal identity is that memory accommodates common sense intuitions. That what matters to us is from the first person perspective. That when I'm saying I am this, I'm saying it from a first person perspective, and I have a sense of what I am insofar as I inhabit that identity. And what allows me to say that I inhabit anything at all is that I've been inhabiting it. I've been here, right? I remember persisting, okay? It's also neutral on what realizes consciousness, what realizes memory, right? So self is that conscious thinking thing, whatever substance made of, be it spiritual, material, simple, compounded, it doesn't matter, right? These are just sort of extra details on what you might be. But what really matters is the memory that you have, the psychological continuity, and that psychological continuity could be housed in the soul. It could be housed in the dead skin underneath your feet. It could be housed in the, like electromagnetic 5G that's making us all go crazy. I don't know, right? You can just make up whatever story you want. and say that that's what does it. And that's not what matters, right? What matters is the fact that we remember what we do for personal identity, okay? So it's consistent with the possibility of an afterlife, okay? So if what I am is what I remember, and I remember my life when I'm, in the afterlife, then, I'm not philosophizing as Locke in an anti-religious way, right? I'm, in fact, doing an empirical project that's consistent with the theological convictions that I have. So Locke would say. And this is how he gets out of trouble with the church, right? Is by satisfying his empiricism and his theology by giving a continuity criterion of personal identity housed in memory that is neutral on what realizes that memory, be it 5G. I don't think 5G has like a frequency that like even does anything to like our physical matter. Conspiracy theories are weird, man. I don't. What I don't get about conspiracy theories is like how much energy we commit to them, right? Like socially speaking, like people really care. I think there are more important and interesting questions to be asking than, like, is my cell phone giving me cancer? It's not too much can be done about it. I don't know. That's just me. There are philosophy classes on conspiracy theories. I don't teach them. Other people are more up to date than I am. Okay, so let's anticipate a few problems for the memory criterion of identity. What about gaps in consciousness and sleep? Okay, so if what memory does is it makes me persist through time, what happens when I fall asleep or if I lose consciousness? Do I stop being me? That which seems to make it difficulty is this, that this consciousness being interrupted always by forgetfulness, there being no moment of our lives wherein we have the whole train of our past actions before our eyes in one view, meaning like, I don't remember everything. And I don't have like a perfect memory. Thank God. Can you imagine having a perfect memory? Like having the ability, or in fact, being like burdened with the ability to always have all of the information you've ever collected in your entire life through experience, like present before your mind. It's like a lot, right? We forget. And in fact, forgetting is like an important fact of remaining sane and neutral and like are able to live and work in the world, that you can't be thinking about everything you've ever experienced and continue to live normally. We got to just not think about that stuff sometimes. But if it's memory that makes us who we are and we've forgotten or aren't thinking about that, that seems to be kind of a problem. So forgetfulness, there being no moment of our lives wherein we have the whole train of our past actions before our eye in one view, but even the best memories, losing the sight of one part whilst they are viewing another, meaning like memories can change. And in sound sleep, having no thoughts at all, or at least none with that consciousness which marks our waking thoughts. So Locke recognizes this as an issue with the memory criterion of personal identity, that we don't remember everything, that memories shift, that we're not always encoding memories, we're asleep sometimes, there are gaps in consciousness. So here, Locke might partly defend himself by appealing to a potential connection via memory, or a continuous stream of consciousness is not required. Just what matters is that we are able to remember. So say like, I've forgotten what I had for breakfast this morning. I haven't. I had ramen for breakfast because I'm a graduate student and I can't afford anything else. Won't forget that. Eating ramen at like 9 a.m. is an experience. But imagine that I'd forgotten what I had for breakfast this morning, and I see on the table a box of ramen, and like in the evening, and I think to myself, "Oh yeah, that's what I had for breakfast," right? That's enough, maybe, if we want to defend Locke, to say that I'm the same person through time, even if I forgot it. Like I can bring back the memory; it's somewhere in there. And that's enough. But what about cases of significant memory loss? Is anybody familiar with this Christopher Nolan movie on the top? It's Memento. Has anybody seen Memento? No? This is an excellent movie. Okay, so Memento is a movie that goes backwards. There's a Seinfeld episode that does the same thing. But the idea is that the main character, this guy, has short-term memory loss. So he only has memory for like 15, 30 minutes. And it, waxes and wanes. And he's tracking down his wife's killer, and he can't remember anything, right? So what he does is he leaves himself notes, and he tattoos himself with the essential facts that he's like proven, so that he has like this list that he like wakes up and has no idea who he is or where he is or what he's doing, how he's gotten there. He remembers everything up to the point of his accident, but nothing else. And reads his body and then is like immediately back in his investigation. And the plot goes backwards, and it occurs in little like 15-minute snippets of he experiences this and then wakes up and like forgets. Right? Kind of cool. So in cases of significant memory loss, where say you have some terrible accident, prefrontal cortex damage, and you forget everything every 15 minutes, do you wake up as someone new every 15 minutes? Locke considers cases where one suffers the loss of memory, and the part of your life, and you cannot retrieve these memories. It's not like the ramen that you see on the table that reminds you, like, oh, Rosebud or whatever, Citizen Kane reference. So it's not like there are moments where you recall in the past, like you can't. The memories are deleted from your mind forever. And Locke's response is to remind us of the distinction between human and person, that you might have been the same human animal that you were when you were a child playing on your Rosebud sled. And you may be the same animal that you were when you were snarfing down a bowl of like March and ramen at 9 a.m, but you're not the same person. The person you are, you've grown since then. The hours of the day that you've spent, you've become a new person. And in fact, forgetting might make you a better person. So as Locke says, we must take notice that the word I is applied to which in this case is the man only, right? The fact that there was like an animal shaped like a human eating ramen at 9 a.m. for breakfast that they have no memory of, the person has no memory of now. If it is possible for the same man to have distinct incommunicable consciousness at different times, it is past doubt that the same man would make different persons. And jokes aside, this is an interesting conclusion, right? To say that the person at some time has a certain set of memories and experience that is distinct from the person at some future time, which has a certain set of memories and experiences, despite being the same animal, is a little weird, right? So in the case of memory loss, in the Memento movie, every 15 minutes, waking up new person, waking up new person, waking up new person. A connection to who he was before his accident, because he has all those memories, right? But every 15 minutes since then is like a different like branch. So imagine like a tree, the trunk is the life up to the point of the accident. And then you have a bunch of little tiny 15-minute branches of personhood that just like snap in and out of existence and are only really loosely tied together by a screenplay and a bunch of aggressive tattoos all over his body. Again, it's a cool movie. It was on Amazon Prime for a while. I don't know if it still is, but worth the 2 hours for sure. Plus Christopher Nolan, like early Christopher Nolan, super dope Christopher Nolan. The guy like knew how to put a suspense film together. So what do we think? Is this defense satisfactory? If we think that, so it seemed like last we discussed, personal identity was to do with the mind. And Locke seems to present a convincing case that what allows us to say like the mind is the same one at different times is remembering, right? That seems pretty plausible. But it can turn out that if we have different sets of memories stemming from different non-contiguous psychologies, like in the case of memory loss, then the same human animal can be a lot of different people. Are we okay with this? has Locke defended himself from the problem of memory loss? If I don't remember and can't remember, I never was.
What if someone else remembers that person as they were?
What if someone else remembers? Excellent. Yeah. So you might say that identity is not just what's here. And even if it's not just what's here, not just what's in here, not just my memory, but identity is extended. We have, there are arguments about this, like extended consciousness. Think like grandpa and grandson, little Billy, sit on the couch every day and watch television in the morning. Grandpa is an old boomer who doesn't know how to use the remote, but he doesn't need to because he always watches television with little Billy. And little Billy knows how to change all the channels. And so for all intents and purposes, grandpa can use little Billy as, say, like a tool to change the channels he wants to watch television. And now say little Billy is a boy genius and goes to college early. Now grandpa's lost a part of his capacity. He's lost a part of his mind, so to speak, that he no longer has the ability to operate the television. He used to, because he could just have like little Billy do it. But that knowledge is now gone. So there are interesting extended consciousness ideas where like self is extended through our loved ones and through our works and through the objects that we interact with. And a great example is what you just said, that like, look, even if I don't remember it, maybe you do. And just because I have a bad memory doesn't mean I'm not responsible for what I did, right? Maybe I gave you $10 and forgot about it, and you say, hey, thanks for that. Like I really needed that money today to pay for parking on campus. Say what, right? Just because I don't remember it doesn't mean that it didn't happen in, my friend's eyes, right? And this is a good response to say, maybe memory isn't enough, right? What about drunkenness? It's kind of an interesting one. Because it can go in a couple of different directions. You can be totally blackout wasted and operating as a different person with no encoding of memory, or you can kind of like shift how memories are created. Right? So isn't the drunk person who doesn't recall their actions justly punished when sober? Thus, isn't the drunk person the same person as the sober person? It's the same. You're out with your mates drinking and you really have to pee. Okay. And everywhere's closed. And so you're drunk, you pee on the street, whatever. But a cop sees you and, arrests you and takes you in, you sit in the drunk tank and you, wake up, right? You sober up. But you were blackout when you decided to publicly urinate. And now you find yourself in jail. Are you punished justly? Should you be in jail now sober for what your drunk self did? Not a trick question. Should you be in jail for what your drunk self did? Yeah. How about online? You guys also nodding? Or are you shaking your heads? I'm not responsible for myself when I'm drunk. Okay. Well, this is kind of a problem too, right? Because if memory is supposed to be what makes a person, and we want to say that people are blameworthy or people are praiseworthy, but when I am drunk, I'm making no memories, or there is no, remember, it's like the experiential memory, like I remember myself having done it. There's no experiential memory of doing what I did when I was blackout drunk. Now when I'm sober, the connection breaks, right? I'm not the same person, says Locke, but I'm getting the same punishment. That seems unfair. So Locke responds by invoking a distinction between good legal practice and metaphysics. Human laws punish both the sober and blackout drunk person with a justice suitable to their way of knowledge, because in these cases, They cannot distinguish certainly what is real and what is counterfeit. And so the ignorance in drunkenness or sleep is not admitted as a plea. A want of consciousness cannot be proved for him. But in the great day, no one shall be made to answer for what he knows nothing of, but shall receive his doom, his conscience, accusing or excusing him. Meaning that like when the rapture happens or you die or whatever, and you go up to the pearly gates and St. Peter is evaluating your ability to go to heaven or however that's supposed to work, you don't get blamed for what you did when you were blackout. But human justice is imperfect, and we can't really make the difference between the person you were when you're blackout and the person you are now when you're sober. So, you know, we do our best and we punish both. What do we think? Has Locke done it? Has he defended his memory criterion? Maybe. In the great day. No? Yes? Thoughts?
Well, then wouldn't you be responsible for making the decision to get drunk when that you'd be the same person after and before that
Good.
made that decision?
Good. So now what we're doing is saying, look, memory isn't so much what matters, but continuity of something like agency, right? So if I'm the sort of person who makes choices that the result of which hurt others, even if I don't remember the consequence being like the hurting others, I made the choice that put me in the position where others were hurt, right? And so I may not be, strictly speaking, responsible for the exact kind of hurt that was caused because I don't remember it, but I would at least be responsible for putting myself in a negligent, say, position where that kind of harm could occur. That's a really charitable way of reading it. Now, you could be even more direct and say, in cases of negligence like this, say like you drink to absolute excess and become blackout, and break a bunch of laws, like you punch everybody in the gut you walk by when you're blackout, for instance, you're equally responsible because of your negligence for that. And this is often how the court of law works in cases of negligence. So good. But when we're dealing with responsibility, then memory seems to be less important to us than the power of choice or whatever it is in us that gives us agency. And this is an interesting problem that we'll deal with more in a few weeks when we talk about free will. Like, do we have free will? What is free will? And what's the relationship between freedom and responsibility? So remember at the beginning of this lecture, I talked about one of the important features of Locke's account working is that it explains what matters to us about identity. Well, what matters to us is exactly this, is like what we are, how we choose to do what we do, and how we blame and praise others for their choices. And is memory enough to give us that that facet of like why identity matters, and this idea of responsibility being tied to choice making rather than to memory is to point out the importance of choice making for identity and the insufficiency of memory to really kind of explain and account for it. So this should press your intuitions, right? If I was thinking before that it was that my identity was all mind, right? Whatever's going on in my head is who I am. We're starting to see some reasons to think that, well, maybe it's something else as well, or maybe that's not quite the answer. Good. Okay, so we'll conclude Locke. Locke gives a continuity criterion for personal identity. What matters is not substance, but mind. And what makes mind the same, according to Locke, is memory, regardless of drunkenness, regardless of memory loss, These are all different people. The blackout drunk person, different person than the sober one, because they remember differently, and they will each be judged independently at the great day of rapture, right? So I promised thought experiments. We'll end with them because they are kind of fun. How about this? So say there's an evil scientist, maybe he's not evil, an eccentric scientist who says, hey, I need two participants, let's call them A and B, and I want you guys to switch brains. I'm going to take A's brain and put it in B's body. I'm going to take B's brain and put it in A's body. And the experiment is a success. Who's A? B's body with A's brain. Does anybody disagree? Does anybody think something else? No, we all agree that A is just now inhabiting B's body.
I wouldn't say B is entirely A at that point. Just because you can say that, yeah, the person is mostly the brain and the mind is kind of makes who you are, but being in a different body, that's got to change your brain to some extent. We're
Good.
definitely not the same person.
Being in a different body changes your brain. Excellent. So this is an argument forwarded by Bernard Williams, who I think is on our Canvas page as an optional reading. It's a really challenging one, which is why I made it optional. But Bernard Williams defends a bodily continuity criterion of personal identity for this being one of his main reasons, is that if you were to do this brain swap thing, think about like what we are, how is very much how we express ourselves. The little like micro muscle face movements, the smirks, the eyebrow raises, the way that we flare our nostrils, that so much of the way that we communicate and express ourselves is in the little ways that we move our bodies, and every body is a little bit different, so that idiosyncrasies of each body afford a different set of little motions. And as soon as you put the brain in another body, it's going to feel awkward and cumbersome and strange, and you won't be able to communicate or act or interact in the same way that you used to be able to. So all of a sudden, what you've done is you might have a very similar kind of mind, but one that is clunky, cumbersome, and operative in its new body. Good. So how about this one? Same experiment with the body swap. And you say you're A, right? Okay, so you are the first person who's going to get put into B's body. And the experimenter says there's like a 30-minute downtime between like the brain turning back on, like coming on. And in this 30 minutes, I'm going to torture your old body quite a lot. I won't leave any marks. There will be no evidence of it, but I'm going to kick the heck out of your old body. You'll be in B's body, so don't even worry. B's mind will feel all of this pain. It will have an awful time. But after 30 minutes, B will forget everything. And you'll both wake up and there'll be no evidence or memory of the suffering, but I'll torture your body quite a lot. So you should just know that going in, unless you pay me $50. Do you pay the scientist $50 not to torture your old body? How about this? Let's do a vote. Raise your hand if you pay the scientist $50 not to torture your old body. Who doesn't pay the scientist $50? Kyle dramatically doesn't pay the scientist $50.
Not $50.
Would you pay any amount of money?
If I just wake up and like my body hurts, but I didn't go through the torturing, I don't know. To me, that sounds better than giving up money, like what type, like it also depends, that one, it depends on what type of torture. Am I like losing limbs? Am I going to be what people refer to like a vegetable? Like, am I not going to be able to move my body? How far is the torturing going?
Yeah, good. So the thought experiment depends upon, and I'll explain why, but because I haven't like revealed the secret yet of the argument, but the thought experiment depends on there being no memory and no like physical trace of the torture, just like the idea that there will be incredible suffering in your body will be put through the ringer, but like have all its limbs, it'll work just fine afterwards. Are you like irked? The intuition pump is like, are you irked by the idea of your body being tortured, even if you won't be in it, and even if like it bears no mark of the torture? And the money is like, how are you like committed? Money is an easy way to quantify commitment. So it looked like about half or a little bit more were voting to pay the scientist. Your mind follows the brain, and say like the micro face movements, whatever, that like you get all that in the new body too. But we all kind of cared about our old bodies, right? It mattered to us, even though we didn't inhabit it or wouldn't inhabit it post experiment. It's still like worth a bit of cash to us to say like, please don't torture my old body. I would rather it remain intact and whole and wholesome and well. This is another of Bernard Williams' arguments, supposing that bodily continuity is important for personal identity because it matters to us. We care about it. And our care for it is evidence of the fact that it is a part of like what we are. And we're, some amount, whether it be $5 or $50, financially committed in some way. We are willing to sacrifice a little bit to see it do well, just as we might sacrifice a little bit to see our minds do well. These thought experiments, the ideas, they're called intuition pumps, where there's no right answer, right? This is not like a math problem. It's a question meant to gauge what you think, to pump your intuition. So famous one is Mary in the black and white room. Mary is this scientist that exists in a black and white room, and she only ever sees black and white objects. She herself is black and white somehow. And she's also a color scientist, so she reads everything that there is to know about color. She every like physical detail of the wavelength of every color in the color spectrum, and how like visual light operates in the optic nerves in the brain, everything. She's really smart with respect to color, but she lives in a black and white room. Here's your intuition pump. She is led out of the room and sees an apple, fully red apple, for the very first time. Does she learn something new about the color red? Just for fun, does she learn something new about the color red? Is she not surprised? Yeah. So there you go, intuition pump. That's kind of a fun one. Does like the experience of color differ from all of the facts that you might know about color or learn about it? Same thing with identity, right? So next week, what we'll do is we will go through like almost an entire lecture's worth of thought experiments back and forth about identity and continuity, about brain swaps and about body swaps and moving minds over and shifting things bit by bit and clones and all that. It'll be really fun. Watch the Parfit video. It's like 6 minutes from a documentary. It's an excellent video. It gets taken down from time to time because I think it's pirated and posted to YouTube. So if it is taken down, let me know and I'll find another version of it. And read the Hume, because Hume is excellent. He's funny and he's fun and he's brilliant. And we'll go through all of the fun thought experiments together next week. And what we've talked about today is memory, continuity, substance criterion. Next week will be all of these answers are insufficient, and there is no such thing as a sufficient answer for identity. Spoiler alert. Cool. See you then.
Thank you.